Before I begin, I want to thank Solveig and the Holberg Committee for their tireless work and organization in administering this event and these events. As well as my fellow panelists and, of course, Professor Paul Gilroy for inviting me to have this conversation with you. My title is misleading because I tend to be wordy, so I only got to wires today. Kerosene and data are to come. I apologize, but that's the way we roll. I'm going to begin with a short guide quote. And I'm going to take off my glasses because I refuse bifocals. I'm on very bad terms with space. I'm on very bad terms with time. Amy Cesar. I'm going to begin this paper with endings. The endings reveal Paul Gilroy's Planetary Humanism as a framework through which to observe complex ecological, geographic, environmental processes. The Black Atlantic ends with reference to sustainability, intractable poverty, and overdevelopment. Between Camps ends with reference to multiple ecologies, climatic conditions, differential environmental histories. The last chapter of There Ain't No Black in the Union Jack refers to large-scale structural unemployment, the expansion of nuclear power, the rise of new technologies and communicative networks. The final essay in Darker Than Blue situates nature as a resource for hope. The textual endings illuminate the connections between humanity and physiography, which is all of physical geography. These endings are not presented as resolutions, but instead prompt us to consider how Gilroy's larger project, which undoes the promise that geographic identification will lead to an ethical mode of racial belonging, is tied to environmental well-being. In this way, we can understand Gilroy's planetary humanism as an extension of the prevailing themes that so often define his research and writing, specifically identity, place, race, nation, diaspora, and belonging, hold a special place in critical uptakes of his work. What often goes missing is how these concepts are tied to environment, ecology, and nature. Indeed, as I have argued elsewhere, physiography, especially watery and wavy geographies, are central to his thinking. One cannot read the Black Atlantic without wandering into the materiality of the ocean and ocean ways. One cannot fully capture this text without the brutalities of Middle Passage and slave ships and waves and rebellions acting as the infrastructure to the larger argument. As we wander through his writings, we also move through what Gilroy has described as offshore humanism and confront Black Atlantic logics that are recalibrated as a sense of place in a different sense of place, and bring into sharp focus how maritime geographies, pelagic zones function in relation to displacement, belonging, and our collective interhuman relationships. These endings can act as conceptual openings and allow us to think about how race, as an analytical category, is nested within and informs physical geographies. What comes to mind immediately are environmental racism, environmental injustices, the racialized contours of pollution havens, toxic dumping grounds, and other forms of garbage imperialism. We notice that resource extraction, land grabbing, food insecurity, dirty water, water boiling advisories, drought, desertification, the depletion of insects, wildlife, and vegetation are expressions of colonialism and race thinking. There's extensive scholarship that explores and exposes how vulnerable and marginalized communities experience and live through environmental racism. Made up of many debates and insights, what we can glean from this work is that racism is enacted spatially, that racism is an ideology and a set of oppressive actions, both of which coalesce to impact upon physical and human geographies, and that multiple organizations and corporations, including different levels of government, are invested in and profit from various economic processes that harm, abandon, forget, extract from, and displace vulnerable communities and their geographies. These kinds of conversations that are raised under the broad umbrella of environmental racism and environmental injustice not only demonstrate that nature and society are entwined, they also map out sites of environmental disaster, environmental decline, thus cartographically delineating how health and wellness are spatialized unevenly and how place-based inequities are punctuated by racism. It is important to also note that some literatures that attend to environmental injustices are imperfect. There's a tendency, for example, to posit that vulnerable communities are composed of toxic bodies, with Black people exemplifying the penultimate toxicity and thus providing an ideal analytical script that proves, rather than questions, the brutality of environmental racism. Indeed, we are all well aware that the tendency to conceptualize non-white people and the land together as one is a crude and dehumanizing expression of scientific racism. When race and environmental decline conceptually collide, this biocentric argument holds, and we read that passive Black flesh is inscribed by or represented as ecology, or that Black bodies, not Black people, Black bodies, are the receptacles of noxious substances and thus become, through osmosis, toxic landscapes. Here, metaphor prevails and obscures Black humanity and experience. Here we witness not an assertion of capacious Black livingness that is in concert with non-Black communities and extra-human processes and environments, but instead the argument that Black bodies are like poison, Black bodies are like ecology, Black bodies are waste, Black bodies are toxic. The preoccupation with describing subjugated bodies is suffocating. Both the environment and the racialized body become a singular analytic site of degradation. Biological determinism is normalized and spatialized, and conversations that might draw attention to relational and transnational eco-crises are foreclosed. I'm not minimizing environmental racism and the way it negatively impacts upon marginalized communities in very violent and material ways, but instead raising questions about methodology. I believe it is important to repeatedly signal that when dehumanization is central to a theoretical frame, if the method is to describe and prove racism, it will probably lead to the conclusion that Black people are less than human. If the method is to describe and prove racism, Black people become analytical objects that prove that Black people are less than human. The lesson we can learn from some of these analytical pitfalls is that we must carefully work through the racial underpinnings of ecological crises, which can inadvertently or intentionally legitimize dehumanization. Our concerns with the environment should not result in degrading Black humanity. For this reason, I am drawn to interdisciplinary studies that spend time thinking about the connections between physical geography and human geography. For me, this is exemplified in the work of Sylvia Wynter, Édouard Glissant, and Paul Gilroy. Their work stands out as reordering the methodological, temporal, and analytical stakes of liberation. Indeed, it is their work that inspires us to imagine the human as relational to and embedded in physiography without privileging calcified colonial categories and patterns. In this way, their versions of humanism are not simply a stance or a perspective or a framework, but also ways of doing and living the world. In my writing, I've called this Black Atlantic livingness, or following Wynter, being human as praxis. What is notable for me and what is worth paying attention to and what I keep returning to in my work is that this is not a humanism that functions to name something, but is instead a humanism that is a method of Black life. As I noted at the beginning of the paper, Gilroy offers us a way to think about how belonging can be understood in relation to physical geography. He teaches us to pay close attention to the uneven and multiple geographies of nationalism and xenophobia, and notices the ways in which Black diasporic cultures have the potential to and do breach these geographies. In Between Camps, he makes the meaningful connection between transatlantic slavery, climate, time, biological determinism, and environmental determinism. This insight is similar to, but does not twin, Sylvia Wynter's observation that plantation slavery is the foundation to environmental injustice and climate change. Wynter asks us to think through how the transport of Africans during slavery and the extractive economies of plantation slavery and colonialism have over time normalized both racism and ecocide. Taking a different tact, Edward Glissant begins Poetics of Relation with the open boat. He names the economized expression of racial violence as a non-history that unravels into his stunning and provocative critique of filial geographies. One way to take up these observations is to suggest that these authors are, in different ways, offering a teleological explanation that ties racist histories to contemporary forms of environmental racism. The argument could be made that there's a direct line between the race thinking of slavery and our contemporary environmental predicament. I think in some ways, yes, we must address how plantation economies, which included the commodification of Black people, provided the conditions for contemporary forms of land exploitation and racial violence. However, this leap across time risks situating Black people within a specific time frame and pushes them forward in the present with time, personhood, space, and other factors ostensibly unchanged. This kind of argument mistreats the complexity of Black time by obscuring Black time. It also analytically represses or undermines rebellion, multiplicity, relationality, temporal interruptions, and Black life, because it is an argument that can only make sense by privileging non-personhood as an origin story. And so we can see this in, of course, Wretched of the Earth, Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, but also Ruthie Gilmore's work where she talks about we should not begin from defeat. I suspect, in fact, that the leap across time that I'm talking about leads to the toxic bodies I mentioned earlier. It is for this reason I think it's necessary to be cautious about how we use what has been called the afterlife of slavery, because the term, which yokes slavery to the present in potentially complicated and meaningful ways, is sometimes mobilized as an analytical pathway that conflates the past and the present. The conflation posits that nothing has changed when we know that much has changed. We know that racism and empire and capitalism, or more specifically, those living beings who invest in and profit from exploitation and abandonment, are continually finding new ways to destroy our worlds. My problem is not with the term, the afterlife of slavery, or with its author, but rather with the ways it can be used as a kind of teleological time machine that captures a permanent and authentic, often US, Black history and moves it across time. It is potentially a progress narrative as well. I wager that this kind of time machine is utilized and reproduced because of a preoccupation with describing degraded Black humanity that is then folded into profitable academic learning objectives that seek to validate degraded Black humanity. And as we know, validating degraded Black humanity in the academy and in scholarship is often the work that is funded. At the same time, the time machine is utilized and reproduced because we must in some way respond to racial terror and work out how and why the past seems to be repeating itself, even though we know in our hearts that much has changed. We know in our hearts that those in power are always finding new ways to oppress us. This is a terrible predicament, but I suspect that how we respond to racial terror can sometimes keep in place a knowledge system that does not allow us to see in the present Black life for what it is and for what it was then and what it is now. So even though we cannot see clearly, this knowledge system paradoxically demands a kind of false clarity and thus clings to Black objecthood as a way to verify itself. The false clarity is marketable, as I mentioned. Black objecthood is academic currency. The time machine folds Black time into prevailing temporalities, and the verification of objecthood is reinforced as we reproduce the obligations of racial observance. I guess what I am saying is that our attachment to market time is underpinned by what Gilroy calls a theater of history that is accentuated by racial hierarchy. Our methodologies and scholarly questions can be negatively shaped by capital. Our attachment to market time can suspend liberation. And in concert with physiography, our attachment to market time harms precisely because it reifies a belief system that, as Frantz Fanon notes, sways between atomic and spiritual disintegration. So one of our collective tasks is to work through how race thinking, racial terror, physical geography, if they analytically adhere to market time, enunciate multi-scalar human and extra-human unfreedoms by annihilating Black time and space. To return to Gilroy, Wynter, and Glissant, I think they work through a different kind of temporal history. I do not think they present us with the Middle Passage or the plantation or the slave ship as exacting, forward-moving explanations for our contemporary global crises. However, I do think the history of slavery and its infrastructures are relevant to their work. So what are we left with? I argue that they use method and pedagogy to reimagine how we attend to the thorny relationship between race, environment, and time. The method and lesson is not a template that one applies to an analytical site or an archive, but a way of doing intellectual work that both holds on to and releases the living memory of slavery. This means that we must take that history of imperialism, indentureship, colonialism, and slavery and put them to work so as to avoid the pitfalls of what Wynter calls liberal monohumanism, or the humanism Glissant writes, where idiots get trapped. The nuance here is important because they are asking that we work with the knotted and relational underpinnings of colonial plantation histories rather than beginning with and then moving away from the crude categorizations imposed by Eurocentric modernity and its practitioners. In forefronting the complexity of Black humanity and reorienting the history of Blackness outside the logics of racism, their sense of time becomes sinuous and unpredictable rather than linear. Their insights uniquely notice that how we enter into history, which is tied to how we analytically and experientially grapple with the racial underpinnings of geography, teaches us the brutal limits of conflating land and blood, and therefore time and space. This reordering of time is an analytical and methodological gift. It allows us to recalibrate our relationship with the environment by teaching us about how to read physiography as both relational to Black humanity and a location of anti-colonial possibility that does not reify racial authenticities. This is extremely difficult intellectual work. It is a hard vision to sustain precisely because they are asking that we respond to ongoing practices of racial violence and other forms of oppression, including environmental injustices, as connected but not conflated. They ask us to learn from Black intellectual labor without essentializing Blackness or other racial identifications. And part of this is a lesson in understanding that the regime of racial terror perfected during plantation slavery provided the conditions to totally rethink our racial attachments in the present. The rethinking notices that the fallout of transatlantic slavery, the historically present wreckage of colonialism, can include the absolute refusal of territory and territorialization. The rethinking requires that our relationship to land be, to borrow from Gilroy, restless and moody. What you see is an ongoing critique of geography as the basis for belonging that extends to our environmental well-being. In this way, the question of physiography and what we do with race and environment has less to do with drawing a line between the past and the present, and more to do with the brutalities of the past, with how the brutalities of the past provide a new or different analytics of belonging. It is worth repeating that this is not a question of dishonoring the history of enslavement or contemporary forms of racism, but instead a plea to work with what that history gave us, which is, as Frantz Fanon would write, a new humanism, and by extension, as seen in the work of Gilroy, Wynter, and Glissant, a re-enchanted humanism, a planetary humanism, an aesthetics of disruption and intrusion. In this way, how we relate to each other and how we relate to our ecologies and environments and extra-human physiography is not a system of thought per se, but a way of living. This is a long way of saying that I believe that Glissant, Wynter, and Gilroy offer a reading practice. They offer ways of reading. I want to really emphasize here that I'm not focusing on what they write as much as I'm focusing on how they teach us to read. This is, for me, one of the more meaningful ways to engage and write Black studies in what Gilroy calls planetary humanism, and it should be continually thought through, enacted, and revisited. To understand planetary humanism as a lesson, rather than a series of descriptions that stand alone, opens up immense analytical possibilities wherein Black humanity and Black livingness, under the strain of objecthood and geographies of distress, provide clues to read, live, and inhabit this world outside the logics of white supremacy. Put otherwise, if we are committed to envisioning and living a humanism made to the measure of the world, a planetary humanism, radical reading practices in part make that world possible. The work of scholars such as Gilroy, Glissant, and Wynter are lessons in how we can theorize and perhaps more fully realize our planetary hopes. This means we must enter into time differently and position our intellectual work as an unsettled praxis that is committed to teaching and learning, or as Glissant says, giving on and giving with, rather than a series of static, descriptive statements that seamlessly move across time and space. This is an especially challenging pedagogy because we know things have changed, but we do not always have the language to express that change because it is grounded in a familiarity that we did not and do not live. The unfamiliarity is, I am suggesting, an invitation to learn rather than know totally. This is, I think, the under-acknowledged gift of planetary humanism, the lesson to live and read differently and enter into a conversation about our collective human and extra-human ecologies as curious beings. The lesson is to share an analytic that is committed to undoing harm rather than repeatedly describing harm. The lesson is to sit with and learn from Black time without privileging racial authenticities. I have time. In the time I have left, I'll turn to one very short case study to demonstrate what this reading practice has offered me. In a much longer version of this project, I want to explore how questions of data mining and data collection are conceptually tied to land grabbing, how kerosene acts as an origin story for the poets Marlene Nerbezi Phillip and June Jordan, and as well I explore Ruth Wilson Gilmore's theories of abolition and extraction and address soil sampling as an anti-colonial praxis. In this larger research program, I'm returning to the untidy connections between race and physiography, paying close attention to what Black poetic ecologies do to our sense of time. But for now, I turn to wires and to bees. And I have here in square brackets, insert Beyonce joke, but I couldn't come up with one, and I will not talk about her. I'm sorry for those in the crowd that are... Charmaine Lurch is a Toronto artist, and her artist portfolio includes giant wire sculptures of bees. Wires are bundled and form thick and heavy landscapes. Wires hold exoskeletons and wings together. The giant wire sculptures cast shadows. Lurch studied the work of and had conversations with bee specialist Lawrence Packer at York University in Toronto. She explored local species of bees, primarily those in Ontario, Canada. And she made each wire sculpture correspond with different bee types. For example, the tricolored bumblebee is made with mixed copper and black wire. The sweat bee is made with green wool and mixed wire. The cuckoo bee is made with red and brown wool and mixed wire. Diasporic literacy allows us to notice how Lurch connects Black life to ecological matter and the bees, drawing attention to human environmental relationalities. Specifically, we can recall the bees in Beloved, in Eva's Man, in Their Eyes Were Watching God. We remember the bees invoked by hip-hop artists Little Kim and Missy Elliott. We come across distracting bees in Teju Cole and John Keane. We can then move through some scientific narratives: pollination, bee dances and communications, wax and honey production, hives, colonies, eusocial labor and cooperation, and nests burrowed in the soil. Bees are ancient insects and planetary insects. We read that honeybees probably arrived in North America in the 1600s alongside colonization, alongside extraction, alongside slavery and agricultural production, alongside settlements and reserves and plantations. We read that honeybees were not the first bees in North America. The bees measure our history of violence and expand that history outside itself. The bees do not have the same rhythm as colonial time. They can be tracked, yet at the same time inhabit worlds we cannot temporally grasp. We read that some bees are endangered and that endangerment signifies our present monumental eco-crises. The wire materials complement metal bendable tubes. The wire allows us to link art worlds to metals and thus to computer hard drives, vascular stents, data cables, piano strings, guitar strings, and fences. In wire, we are given finance, empire, environmental decay, exploitation, and enclosure. In wire, we are given sound. Lurch's bees are an expression of an expansive and unfinished relationality. When thought about alongside the valuable lessons imparted by Wynter, Glissant, and Gilroy, the bees can be conceptualized as non-human objects, art objects, and insect worlds that are tied to a range of human actions and held together by wire, wool, and narrative. As curiosity, rather than an object that is knowable, the bees are lessons through which we become agentive learners, listeners, and readers. Rather than simply dwelling on what the bees are at the level of description, we can understand these wire sculptures as prompts that readjust and redefine our relationship with physiography while also leaving room for wonder. We could be mystified with how black the bees are, particularly given their symbolic currency in African American popular culture. We could posit that they are metaphors for Black humanity and sociality. We could follow a line that begins with bee migration and colonialism and ends with extinction. We could as well use them as evidence of pre-colonial nostalgia. These themes are full of possibility and also laden with limitations. I wonder, therefore, if the bees might instead give us permission to bring some of these narratives together, as well as perhaps discard a few, and read the wire bees as inviting a collaborative analytics of inquiry and open-ended wonder. What if the bees represent our nonlinear history? This might, at least for a moment, ward off the desire to conflate the environment and race, which is accentuated by the unkind allure of territory. It might allow us to refuse the celebration and emptiness of those race metaphors that are excised of experience and materiality. It might, too, deny the currency that comes with describing environmental racism as Black subordination and violation. Maybe the bees cannot be captured. The uncaptured brings us back to the collaborative and open-ended wonder that uncovers planetary humanism as a dynamic pedagogy and practice, rather than a downward pressing narrative. Refusing the stasis of a noun, planetary humanism as a verb, as a lesson, as an interruption in time, as a readjustment in how we use historical categories, positions our interhuman and interecological predicament as one that necessitates cooperative listening and reading. This planetary humanism of doing, a humanism of practice and action and collaboration rather than a humanism of description, brings into sharp focus a way of being human, a mode of Black Atlantic livingness, where the work of liberation is not just a set of ideas, but a way of teaching and showing each other how to live the world anew. Thank you.